Welcome to the Eat for Endurance podcast, where we explore the connection between nutrition, performance, and health for busy, active people. My name is Claire Shorenstein, and I am a board-certified sports dietitian and endurance athlete with over 10 years of experience working with teenage and adult athletes of all abilities. I started this podcast to provide evidence-based guidance, inspiring athlete stories, and practical tips on a wide variety of nutrition topics so that you can feel better, crush your endurance goals, and thrive as a human being. Today, I'm chatting with sports dietitian Vic Johnson of Mountain Sports Nutrition. Vic normally lives in Utah with his family, but I caught him in New Zealand on the tail end of a year-long trip around the world, which sounds so amazing. I would love to go there someday. I invited Vic on the show to chat about ergogenic aids, or supplements that benefit performance, especially for endurance athletes. We focused primarily on caffeine, sodium bicarbonate, and ketone esters, as these are incredibly popular in the endurance world and are most commonly used among many of Vic's elite athlete clients. We also touch on a few others, including polyphenols, dietary nitrates, and omega-3s, among a few others, but really caffeine, sodium bicarb, and ketone esters are the ones that we deep dive into. Vic and I both make it clear that using performance supplements should be the cherry on the top of your nutrition plan. Always be sure to focus on the basics, meaning dialing in your hydration, your everyday food intake, performance nutrition, sleep, etc., before trying some of these supplements, especially the ones with a bit less research behind them. But since so many athletes are interested in these supplements, we wanted to dive into some of them today to chat about potential benefits as well as risks. Because with supplements, there are always risks involved, with some more than others. Before we get started, I just wanted to ask a quick favor. If you're enjoying the show and all the free content I produce, please consider leaving a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen and sharing your favorite episode with a friend. Also, don't forget to hit follow or subscribe so you don't miss an episode. All right, here's my chat with fellow sports RD, Vic Johnson. Vic, welcome to the Eat for Endurance podcast today. How's everything going in New Zealand, where I just learned you are at right now?
Thank you so much for having me. We're great here. Yeah, we're in New Zealand, the South Island right now. We were in the north for a little bit, and we're in the south for about another month, and then we're headed back to the States. So, yeah.
And it's you and your wife, and you have, how old's your child?
2.5. 2.5.
2.5.
Boy. Yeah.
Oh, wow. That is so cool. That's something I've always thought about doing, or in theory, sounds amazing, but I don't think I have the personality to travel with my young children. Clearly you do. I would love to hear a little bit about I know we're going to get into all sorts of things, including your background as a dietitian and everything, but this fascinates me. I just learned this about you. So I want to hear more about this year of travel with your young child.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's probably comes down to my wife being who she is. She loves travel. She studied anthropology in college and wanted to see more cultures and be around the world. So even when we were dating and first married, we would travel a lot, just the two of us. And we kind of always told ourselves, even when we have kids, we want to still make this happen. And so we have a house in Utah, and we were fortunate enough that some of our friends needed a place to rent. And so we actually rented our house out, and we both work remote for the most part. So we were able to just kind of say, let's go wherever we want to go. And so we're kind of we're at the tail end of this big year-long stint of travel where we're kind of going east around the globe. So we were in Europe, and then we made our way over to Asia for several months. We were visiting my sister in Australia for a couple of weeks, and then now New Zealand, and then back to the States. So
that's so cool. I love that. And I've seen you've kind of hopped back into various US races, or I think I have. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I think I've seen stuff on Instagram where you've actually been physically present at races for your athletes, or no?
I actually haven't been back.
Oh, you haven't? Okay. That was my bad. Okay.
I've done a couple of races while being abroad. Okay. And I've had a lot of FOMO for a lot of the races that have been happening back in the US.
I'm sure everyone has FOMO for what you've been doing, though.
Yeah. There's good trade-offs there. So
yeah. Very cool. Well, before we dive into today's topic, and we have some good stuff we're going to talk about, I'd love just to hear more about your background as a sports dietitian as well as an athlete.
So yeah, I'm a sports dietitian primarily for mountain endurance athletes. So primarily trail runners, ultra runners, cyclists, triathletes, skiers, ski mountaineers, people who love moving through, wild terrain quickly
Yeah.
is kind of those are the things that I like to do. And it brings me great joy to work with those sorts of athletes too. But yeah, a little bit of background. My undergrad was actually in psychology, and I didn't really realize how much I was going to be using that when working with athletes, but it's really helpful just to kind of feel like I understand people a little bit more, maybe because of that background. But I got my graduate degree, master's degree at Northern Arizona University in dietetics and public health. So it's kind of like a dual degree from the university there. And I actually got a really lot of good experience working with the student athletes. There was a cool research lab at NAU, and I knew the professor really well, and he brought me on to help work with the athletes there. So that was a lot of really good experience working with them one-on-one and doing like team seminars and like even like cooking for the athletes sometimes, and like setting up like a smoothie stand like before football practice and stuff like that. So it was really, really good experience working there in Flagstaff with the athletes. And then, yeah, it was kind of serendipitous, but I started working with a couple of athletes online. They just kind of reached out and asked if I did coaching. And this was actually even before I had my dietetics degree. So I was technically still a nutritionist.
We won't tell anybody.
Not a dietitian, which was still legal, but I always kind of had a little bit of like, ooh, I don't know. But, and and people knew that. And so they knew what they were getting. And I charged next to nothing when I was first working. But yeah, so I kind of started working with some athletes online, just remotely doing coaching sessions, and slowly worked my way up to work with more and more and more. And in the meantime, got my degree. And then, yeah, I've been coaching for maybe 5-6 years now and work with athletes all over the world. So I love it. Super fun. It's really exciting for me to be a part of, like, even if it's a small part, a part of these athletes' success as, they're doing some of these big races and events.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, you work with quite a few elite athletes, it seems. Like I just had Tara Dower on. I know you work with her.
Amazing. Yeah.
She's awesome.
So cool.
And, I know you work with a handful of people kind of at the very, very top of the top level. I worked with some elites, but I'd say the bulk of my practice is like the everyday recreational, super busy athlete that's like trying to squeeze everything in. That's kind of
awesome.
like that's what I am. And that's who I often help. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious about how you kind of got into more working with that population. Am I correct in even saying that that's kind of the bulk of who you work with, or do you kind of work with all kinds of different people?
It's probably about half and half right now.
Okay.
But yeah, I do work with a lot of elites at the moment, mostly elite trail and ultra runners, although I have and do work with a few elite cyclists and triathletes as well right now. But yeah, I would say, and maybe you know a little bit of this backstory, but kind of one of my big breakthrough moments was I was working with Rod Farvard.
Yes, I think I read your Substack on that one.
Yeah, and he had a really good performance at Canyons, and he alluded to our coaching a lot when he was doing the post-race interviews and things like that. And he really felt like what we had done had changed the outcome for him in a big way. And so him just being so vocal about that kind of opened the doors for a lot of other elite athletes to want to come start working with me.
Sure.
And so that was, I guess it was almost exactly a year ago, because Canyons is this weekend.
Yeah.
When that kind of happened. And I had already worked with a few pros and elites before then, but it was more well known that I was working with elites and pros after that.
Word of mouth is everything.
Yeah, it's word of mouth. It's been really awesome and kind of crazy. And don't get me wrong, like you, I really enjoy working with amateur athletes as well, and even sometimes athletes with like chronic health issues and things like that, because at the end of the day, it's really cool to help a pro athlete like get on the podium and whatever, win a big race or something like that. That's cool. But like helping someone like lower their A1C or something that's like truly meaningful for their life and health is like such important work. And so maybe it's slightly less like a sexy or glamorous or something like that.
Yeah. Like, it's all meaningful, right?
It's super, super meaningful. And so, I hold both of those in high value, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, part of the reason I bring it up is because it's so pertinent to today's discussion, at least from how I'd like to enter the topic, which is ergogenic aids or supplements that benefit performance specifically for endurance athletes. And because, so clearly you work with a wide range of athletes, but you do, as you say, half and half. So you have this like elite field that you work with, and then you have all these other people you work with. So I thought it'd just be really interesting as a way of entering this discussion to hear which supplements do you commonly recommend? I mean, if at all, maybe you don't recommend any supplements, I don't know, but which supplements in this kind of performance aspects, not necessarily just like, oh, you're deficient in iron, take iron, but yeah, which ones do you recommend and what your, professional or maybe even personal experiences have been with these supplements or other supplements. So just curious to hear first your experience kind of in your own practice, and then we can kind of dive into the more broader category of performance supplements.
Yeah, no, that's such a good question and topic. Yeah, and obviously there's like the day-to-day supplements that you're talking about, if someone's taking a multivitamin or I would even categorize like, long chain omega-3s under that, even though there are, there's potential performance there too, but it's kind of this like hazy line between like the day-to-day and the performance. Yeah. So there's those, and usually we'll do blood work. I'll have the athletes look at blood work with me, in conjunction with what we're doing so that we can kind of know exactly what we need to do as far as blood work goes. And then we'll do, diet recalls and tracking on chronometer or whatever for a week or two. And, just to see if there are things that we do need to be supplementing within their day to day. But then as far as the sports nutrition, the performance side of things, I would say the number one supplement that athletes are taking is caffeine, right? It's very well researched, clearly beneficial in many ways. And so that's probably the biggest one. And then there's a couple of others that some athletes dabble with a bit, depending on how interested they are. Or also a lot of them have heard of other athletes using the supplement, or their training coach has recommended it in some instances. And some of those have more research than others.
Yeah. I already know which ones you're going to say. So let's get into it.
So ketone esters is a big one right now that a lot of athletes are using. And, I have mixed opinions on it, but a lot of my athletes do end up using those. Sodium bicarb is another one of those that can cause issues and can potentially improve performance depending. Nitrates, and that's actually a pretty safe one. And there is actually some pretty decent research for endurance.
But in what form? Like what form are you doing it?
So a lot of the athletes will use, like they'll hop on the feed and get like Beat Elite, like either capsules or like powder or something like that.
Okay.
But honestly, I usually just recommend like beetroot juice. It's the cheapest. It's, you know what's in there. It's just beet juice. So
do you find that it's effective, especially like in the elite population, just given we know that they're potentially less responsive? Like, so is that something you guys are generally trying? And
I would say
as
probably
much or not
25% of the athletes that I work with try it, but usually, to your point, probably fewer elites and more of the amateur athletes are doing that, and that does reflect the research on nitrates. And then there's always the potential downside, it's a diuretic. And so sometimes athletes will get digestive issues, or they'll be, urinating a lot when they use it, but usually not. Usually people are pretty okay. And I find that the athletes that are used to eating, a lot of leafy greens or, root vegetables or whatever in their normal day to day tend to be able to handle beetroot juice a little bit better. Yeah. And then there's like the odd ones here and there, beta alanine. A lot
in your trail and ultra runners? Is it more like your shorter distance ones?
They'll ask about it, and usually I'll tell them like, "Hey, it's mostly for like fast, explosive, shorter work, And then, this could, this is also sort of related to the day-to-day stuff, but like creatine or collagen also get talked about quite a bit as well. So I would say those are kind of the big ones that we usually talk about with the athletes.
So I think maybe a fun way of doing this is we can kind of just like go deep or just dive a little bit into some of the ones you just mentioned, and we can talk about some general stuff about it. I'm happy to chime in on some of this too. But we can talk about some general stuff, and then maybe any observations with like if there are any, like, obviously you can't reveal anything from your clients, but like if there are any kind of just experiences you've had with it, maybe you've had your own personal experience or just anything else do you think might be interesting to add to the discussion about each one, that would be cool. So let's kick things off with caffeine. Obviously that is very well researched, very widely used in so many different ways. And there are lots of different ways to go about it. And I think what can be very confusing for people is like, if it's in a gel, it might be 100 milligrams. It might be like 20 to 30. Like maybe they're getting little doses in a drink. Maybe they're doing like a caffeine gum. I mean, there's just like so many forms of it. Yeah. And we know like, okay, you should be aiming for 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. But then we have these like really long distances. So it's like, are you doing it very gradually?
Yeah. 18 hours.
Yeah. So it's like how to figure out like where to put it and in what dosage. And I'm curious kind of what your experience has been with that and where you've seen like success with your athletes.
Yeah. And I usually do try to be somewhere in that range of 3 to 6 milligrams per kilo.
Is that per 24 hours, would you say, for that? What are you doing for that?
So I usually say, because, caffeine is kind of this bell curve, right?
Yeah.
And so you'll take it, it'll hit the bloodstream and slowly rise in the bloodstream until it peaks. And that time is a little different for everyone. Some people, it'll peak in their bloodstream 15 minutes after, taking a gel. Probably also depends on stomach contents and gastric emptying as well. Although you are absorbing a little bit in your mouth and even in your stomach, right? But yeah, basically there's this bell curve. And so I have found that curve, if we keep that to about 2 to 3 hours, so about 3 to 6 milligrams per kilo every 2 to 3 hours, that tends to work pretty well for a lot of these events. Now, people are always surprised by how much caffeine that is, even 3 milligrams per kilo. And lots of times I'll actually break that down per hour and just half it. So 1.5 milligrams per kilo to 3 milligrams per kilo per hour rather than over the course of 2 hours. And that tends to keep them kind of riding that high, if you will. But yeah, people are used to like, they'll be like, oh yeah, I use a lot of caffeine. And they'll bring, I'll be like, well, what's your source? It's some gel with like 20 milligrams. And it's like, I had 3 of those during the whole race. And it was like, that's nothing. Like that is and maybe that's, giving you placebo. And we love placebo, right? In nutrition,
yeah.
Like we'll take it, right? But yeah, to actually have some of these physiological benefits, I find that you do need to dose quite a bit more. And it does become trickier the longer the event, right? Or the longer the adventure or whatever you're doing, because that GI issue risk that comes with higher caffeine use or prolonged caffeine use. And where there's already so many other risk factors and variables for GI issues, it's like we want to be pretty careful and cautious with not overdoing that caffeine. So a lot of times what I'll do is for athletes that are doing a relatively longer race, so let's say, 100K distance, let's say 10 plus hours, something like that, lots of times we'll just caffeinate the back half if it's a daytime race so that they're only doing, 4 or 5 hours in a row of, 1.5 milligrams per kilo or whatever. And for most athletes, that would be somewhere around 75, 100 milligrams an hour-ish. That being said, there's a lot of my athletes who have done it in previous races, or they've pieced together a long run or a long ride where they are able to hit 100 milligrams for 5 hours in a row, no GI issues. They're hydrating well, they're fueling well, their electrolytes are dialed, like all of the other variables are good. And they've shown on several long training sessions that they can handle it. I'm much more willing to kind of take the risk than on these longer events and say, yeah, if you're open to it, let's caffeinate the whole thing. And lots of times we'll lower the dose a little bit if we're going to do that. But yeah, there's athletes who have, caffeinated all of CCC or Western States and like not had issues. So you can certainly do it, but you are increasing the risk. And I like to make that clear with the athletes that like, this is a risk factor for GI issues, but if there aren't GI issues, it could really make a difference in how you're feeling. So that's usually how I approach it.
Is that something like those kinds of risks, is that something you're really only doing with your elite athletes and less so with your amateurs, would you say? Or yeah, because it's like because it's really worth it if they're going to benefit, right?
Yeah, where it's like, if this is going to be the difference between a podium spot or not, it might be worth it at that point. And to that point, like some of those elite athletes, it's either on the podium or not for some of their performances. And so it's like, if they're not going to get on the podium, then they might as well blow up. Like it's like, and that's kind of a weird way to look at it. And I don't even know, like, I don't know, it kind of bugs me sometimes when athletes like, finish a race because they're not going to win or whatever. But sometimes, I don't know, if they're thinking about their whole season or whatever like that, then you do have to take into consideration kind of the gravity of doing well in these races and whether or not it's worth it. But I do really like to see several long training sessions where they've successfully done the same exact source of caffeine. So whether that's a gel or a drink or chews or whatever that they're going to be using during the race, and see them do that successfully.
Yeah. That's so interesting because, again, I am not, like, I don't have any elites currently that I'm working with. And like when I'm working with people right now, my amateurs who are training for longer events, whether it's like a marathon marathon, obviously it's a lot shorter, but if they're doing like some sort of ultra, sometimes we're doing either lower doses, or if they're doing like 100 milligrams, we're kind of spacing them out, or maybe there's one right before the start and then we save it for an overnight, and then we're really saving it for the dark hours. And then we kind of, so there's like a lot of strategies here. When I think about a 75 to 100 milligram dose every single hour, that to me is like, oh yeah, that's an elite runner that's not running as long as like someone who's out there for like over 24 hours or is doing like a 5-hour marathon or something like that. But yeah, so from where I sit, I'm often trying to figure out, okay, if you are going to use caffeine, which, I think most people should at least try to see how it helps them if they'd like, what's the lowest possible dose we can use where you see a benefit to kind of lower the risk, especially because a lot of people are already struggling with GI stuff. And it's like, we don't want to take that risk. You don't care about the podium, obviously. You just want to finish your race and have fun and not be like shitting in the woods somewhere. So yeah, I think it's one of those things where, like all these different supplements, we're always going to consider like who you are, what you're trying to accomplish, what your event is, what the distance, all that kind of stuff. So it's really interesting to hear kind of where you take things.
100%.
With your amateur athletes, do you have any kind of other strategies you're currently using that seem to work well for people that you want to share?
Yeah. And I think to your last point, like before we get deeper into any of these ergogenic aids, like it's so important to note that like these things that we're talking about are like the cherry on top, right? Like there's all of these other like variables that are so much more important and will improve performance more than worrying about, supplements or ergogenic aids. Like eating enough in your day-to-day nutrition and getting the right types of nutrients, or just eating more carbs. It's like the
eating more carbs
thing in the world.
But that's everything.
And then hydration during your event, and fueling during your event, and even electrolytes, although that could potentially be considered a supplement as well, depending on how you want to look at it. But
sure.
But yeah, these are the cherries on top, where we're only like, caffeine is the last thing I'll talk about when we're getting ready for an event over the course of like a training block or something like that, where it's like,
totally,
we'll spend weeks dialing in, sweat rates and hydration and electrolytes before we even talk about carbohydrate intake. And it's like you have to establish these baseline other variables that are so important before you get to some of the stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, for my amateur athletes with caffeine, still use similar research, maybe a little less aggressive. And if they are going to be out there for a longer duration, then we'll usually lower that dose. So that might look closer to like 0.8 milligrams per kilo or 1 milligram per kilo, depending on the event and how long they're going to be out there. And that also goes for some of these unique events, like the races that are going through the night, or something like Cocodona, or like these 200, like Tahoe or Moab or whatever, like these 200-mile races, where you're out there for like 5 days, and it's like are you going to be doing 100 milligrams an hour for 5 days?
No,
you're not.
no.
Like we will have issues if that's the case. So yeah,
And
more
sleep.
strategic
Sleep's the other part about this, and especially like with training runs and all of that, and you're taking in all of this caffeine and you need to like sleep to recover. And so we always want to think about, okay, how is this going to affect sleep? So yeah, it can be tricky to figure all this stuff out.
We just had a couple of sessions with John Kelly, who just ran.
Oh, he's been on my show too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, cool. Sweet. I'll have to listen to that episode.
He's great.
But yeah, John's super awesome guy, amazing athlete. But yeah, we had to do kind of a really unique caffeine protocol for him because he didn't really want to sleep that much during Barkley, but it was still a very long race. And so we didn't want to go super high intake, especially during the night. So it was kind of like titrated and kind of ebbed and flowed with how much we were doing depending on time of day and things like that. So yeah, every athlete's a little different and everyone tolerates a little bit different. And, I find that there's not a whole lot of supporting research showing that like if you're a habitual caffeine user, that it really changes how you need to use it during events or whatever. But anecdotally and subjectively, I have found that that does change for like some people are more sensitive to caffeine, especially if they don't drink a lot of coffee or something like that. And smaller doses can go further for them. And who knows, part of that could be placebo too. But again, we'll take placebo and that's fine. Like if they think it's working, it's probably working, So.
Yeah, totally. I want to take a quick break to shout out my virtual private practice, Eat for Endurance. You might think that working with a sports dietitian like myself may not be within your budget, and I wanted to make sure you're aware that I have many free and extremely low-cost resources and services available to you. I currently have 7 free nutrition downloads that you can grab at my website, eatforendurance.com. And if you want direct access to me but have a limited budget, then you'll love my nutrition membership, Fuel for Life Crew. For just $30 a month, you get to ask me all your nutrition questions, get the support of a small but growing community of busy, active people just like you, and you also get full access to my online nutrition resources, plus live monthly calls on different topics that you help choose. Also, there's no commitment. Try it for a month and cancel anytime, not a big deal. Visit my website, eatforendurance.com, to sign up or to explore my one-to-one nutrition coaching services. All right, let's get back to the episode. Let's go to bicarb, because that's one where it's like, is it really helpful for endurance athletes based on the research that you were hearing about it? And yeah. So, I mean, there are a number of studies and, with different doses taken, prior to different lengths of exercise and all of that. And yeah, I'm just curious to kind of hear what your experience has been with it. This is another one. I mean, part of the reason why I want to do this episode, even though, as you said, it is the cherry on the top, there's so many things that we are addressing with athletes before you even get here. But people ask about this stuff and they hear about it and people are talking about it. So it's good to address it. So yeah, let's chat about sodium bicarb, how you've been using it with athletes, if at all. Any other information you want to share with my audience?
Yeah. There's a lot of my athletes, especially elite level athletes, who are currently using sodium bicarb. A lot of that is because of the roaches.
I was gonna say caffeine and high carb fueling and sodium bicarb. Yep.
Which for the most part, I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. And they send a lot of athletes my way to work with me, and it's great. I love the roaches; they're great. And I think it should be something that should be considered on an individual basis, and it shouldn't just be this blanket. Like if you're an elite trail runner, you should be using bicarb. Like I think the research isn't there to support that yet, and maybe it will be. Maybe we will see that there is the research there. But a lot of the athletes that I work with are very interested in it, primarily because of their coaches, or they're seeing that other elite athletes are doing it. I still need to write about this, but I put out a survey after Black Canyon 100K and asked a bunch of questions about what people were using and GI issues and stuff like that. So there's a lot of data that we got from that, which will be cool to write about, and just taking me forever to get around to doing it. But it was about half of so I just sent out the survey to the top 10 male and female finishers. And it was about half, like about 50% of both fields were using sodium bicarb before the race, which was more than I thought it was going to be, honestly. And obviously I don't work with all of them, so I didn't have personal info on each of them. But like, yeah, there were a lot of the athletes that were using it.
Can we define let's just, in case people don't know, even like why are people taking sodium bicarb? Can you just quickly define like what it is and why people are so gung-ho about it?
Yeah. So sodium bicarb is basically baking soda, essentially. And it's a buffering system. So when our cells are metabolizing fuel, right? So when they're using glycogen or fat, they produce hydrogen ions, which is essentially part of lactic acid. It kind of gets complex, but essentially lactic acid or these hydrogen ions is what causes that burning sensation in your muscles when you're working really hard, especially anaerobically. So especially at like really high intensities, when you feel that burning sensation in the back of your calves on a really steep hill climb or something like that, a lot of that is lactate buildup in your cells. So what sodium bicarb does is it will actually help buffer those hydrogen ions and actually put them into your bloodstream, and so that you're able to cycle those out and get rid of those. So yeah, it essentially theoretically helps athletes go longer at these higher intensities without feeling that, burning sensation that's painful and gets you to slow down and stop, or go from a run to a walk, right? For example. Yeah. And most of the research that we've seen up to this point has mostly been on shorter duration activities, and like anything from a few seconds up to about like 5 to 10 minutes is what I've seen in the research, like really not that long. So we're not talking ultra marathons or long, gravel cycling races for most of the research that we're seeing. That being said, anecdotally, a lot of endurance athletes have been using it and have been feeling like it is helpful. And so, yeah, there's a couple of studies on, like, I know I think it was a 40-minute cycling time trial. That's one of the main ones out there right now. And the researchers were able to see some improvements in these time trials with the athletes who were using bicarb. So yeah, there's the potential of it helping, but at the same time, and yeah, we probably should talk about like kind of the physiology and why you can't just mix a bunch of baking soda into water and drink it. But essentially you get these really bad GI issues, and those can be either upper GI issues or lower GI issues, and it can cause nausea and vomiting or diarrhea on the other end, right? If it's not getting absorbed or utilized well. And so a couple of companies, but mostly Morton, has come out with this sodium bicarb system, is what they call it. And essentially it's these tiny little like tablets, like these little capsules, not capsules, like caps. I don't know. They're like the size of like a pencil eraser end. Like they're really, really small. And you mix those into like this hydrogel, and then you eat it like with a spoon. It's like comes in.
Have you tried it? I actually haven't tried it. Does it taste disgusting?
It's just weird because you're not supposed to chew it, right? You're supposed to because you don't want to break up these pellets. Pellets, that's the right word. You don't want to break up these pellets before they're in your intestines, essentially, is what is supposed to happen. And so theoretically, these pellets get encapsulated in this gel. They don't break open in your stomach, so they're not causing like upper GI issues by having this like high osmolality in your stomach or whatever. Then they're supposed to get into your small intestine and then get absorbed right in your intestines without making it to the end of the large intestine unabsorbed. So there's like this window where, you're not going to get GI issues if they're absorbed correctly. And theoretically, you can do this 2 hours to an hour and a half before your event.
With a high carb meal, right? You're supposed to do it with a high carb meal of some. Well, I guess you are anyways, because it's before an event.
Well, and the hydrogel is basically, I don't know if you've had a Morton.
Yes. Oh, is it just the gel? It's basically the gel.
The same thing. Yeah, it's like a little powder that you mix with water, so it's a little more liquidy than that.
Okay.
But it's basically a mix between their drink mix and their gel.
Okay.
It's like a maltodextrin fructose mix. So you're getting, I think per serving it's like 40 grams of carbs or something that. Okay. So, but yeah, you can also eat it with a meal if you want to. I usually tell my athletes to eat that first and then wait for about 30 minutes and then maybe eat a little something else if they're going to have something else before the race. But yeah, I've had athletes say that it helps them feel better, like they feel a difference. And then I've had athletes try it one time and they have diarrhea out on the trail, and it's like, all right,
never again.
Well, that's probably not worth it.
Yeah.
We don't want to deal with that. And I actually did with a good friend of mine. He's also a sports nutrition guy, also coach. He coaches cyclists and skiers and stuff. We did a little time trial of our own on ourselves with sodium bicarb. So we picked a section of trail up above my house in Utah, and we did it. I'm sure we could have carried out this study in a more rigorous scientific way, but it was just the two of us. It was kind of for fun anyway. So, but we did a time trial without the sodium bicarb. So this was one day. I think it was like 13, 14 minute, pretty much all out uphill trail running effort. We had like this certain bush that we were running up to after, up this mountain. And so we did it without sodium bicarb, and he had a little lactate monitor. So we took our blood, like right after, like the other person was waiting at the end of the time trial to do a little blood pinprick and get our lactate readings. And the goal, if the sodium bicarb is working, you have higher levels of lactate in your blood, right? If it's working. And so then the next day we did it again, but we were both on sodium bicarb. So we did the same exact thing. Like we tried to fuel exactly the same and hydrate the same the day before. And then we did it again the next day and did the time trial. We were both faster, if I remember right. We were both faster on the second time. Okay. Obviously, we didn't control for the other variables that could have made that true. Right? Like there was motivation to go faster. There's lots of things that could have made that happen. He responded. So his lactate levels were actually higher with the sodium bicarb, like they should have been. I was not. Mine were actually lower with the sodium bicarb. Now we had just had our baby, and so I was not very well trained.
Yeah.
Like I was like really low volume and like not ideal training. And he was in like tip top shape. And I feel like that could have also made a difference where I was just still so fatigued from our previous time trial the day before that I wasn't recovered well or whatever. So I don't know. Or it could but some people are not responders too. So it was interesting. I would like to do it more, and I'd like to like there should be researchers, maybe there are, but like I would love to see a bigger study on, longer endurance stuff. And even what we did wasn't that long. Like that's still in line with some of the research where it should help. But I would love to do it, have the top 10 women and men at CCC or UTMB, have half of them do sodium bicarb and half of them not, and like see the differences there. So anyway, I think there's potential there.
That's fun.
The research isn't quite there yet.
Yeah. Well, and that's like going to be a perfect segue into ketones, which I think it will be the last one we have time for today. But I mean, I think really like a take-home message, because most of the people listening to this will be, recreational athletes, that some of these supplements, and again, we don't have time to talk about all of them, but some of these supplements have a lot of research. But even if they have a lot of research, you still have to try these things and figure out, like we were talking about dietary nitrates. We're not going to have time to really go into that further, but dietary nitrates have a ton of research behind them. It doesn't mean it's going to work for you or it's worth your money and effort and all of that. Like, at least based on my experience with my population, we often are just spending so much time dialing in the very basic stuff, and, I remember seeing, I think on your Instagram somewhere, you were talking about like hydration or, doing sweat tests and all stuff. And it's like, it's nothing, or maybe it's something you worked on with one of your elites. And it's like, it's nothing groundbreaking. Like this is pretty like standard stuff for us, but for athletes, it's often the first they've heard about this stuff. They've never thought about it. They've never done this stuff. So a lot of times the work we're doing is like the pretty like foundational stuff to get everything dialed in. So so I'll just say that like when we're talking about then different supplements that don't have like the strongest evidence behind it, especially for your specific sport, like ketone esters or sodium bicarb, and like you hear the anecdotal stuff. Like, sure, of course you can try it. Like, no one's ever going to stop. Like, it's your body. You can do whatever you want. You can try whatever. But like, is that the smartest move for you if you haven't like really focused on the basics? No, it isn't. But we're going to talk about ketones anyways, because people want to know. Just had to get that little spiel out of the way.
I think that's
okay,
so important.
Yeah. So, okay, let's talk about exogenous ketones. So ketone ester, not the other version, not the salt or the alcoholic form. That's a really important point, that it's the ketone ester that's been studied the most, or we see some benefits, potentially proposed benefits. So yeah, let's hear about your experience with ketone ester and kind of what you've observed, maybe some anecdotal stuff, because I think there's a lot of anecdotal stuff flying around with this one and people are very curious and but maybe there's some downsides as well. So
and I think there's a ton of athletes using it now. Like there's a lot of companies now. There's the Ketone IQ, which is really popular. There's the is it HVMN? Is that the other one that
I don't know, but is it?
It's like a little B.
Is there only one company that does the ester though? The ketone ester?
I think there's a couple that do.
Oh. See, I have never recommended ketones and I've never tried them, so I'm not even super familiar with the brands. And apparently they taste absolutely disgusting, and there's potentially GI side effects, and they're expensive. Oh, we forgot to mention, by the way, sodium bicarb, the Borton, is freaking expensive.
It is very expensive.
So, isn't it like $80 for like? It's like nuts.
Yeah, well, it used to be $70. Maybe it's 80 now. But
I don't know.
And there's 4 servings, so there's 4 servings. Now, if you're going to buy it from Morton. Don't tell Morton this, but you should be, you'll enter in your weight in kilograms, and then they'll send you a dosage according to that weight. If you do that, just pretend like your weight is a lot more, and they'll send you more. Like you'll be able to divide the servings in half and have 8 servings rather than 4 for the same thing.
Ooh, sneaky sodium bicarb hacks on the podcast. Here we go. I love this.
It's so dumb too, because it's just baking soda. It's like the cheapest thing in the world. But it charged so much for it anyway.
That's so ridiculous.
Ketones also very expensive, like extremely expensive.
Yeah.
They taste awful. Essentially, what the purported benefit of ketones is, well, there's a couple different things, but one of the main things is our bodies can use ketones as an energy source, right? Usually, we don't tap into that energy source unless we are absolutely starving. Unless we have it, if we don't have glucose or glycogen or carbs in the tank, and we're heavily relying on fat metabolism, the production of ketones is a byproduct of fat metabolism, essentially. So if someone's starving, they haven't eaten food in a really long time, their body's eating itself, essentially, right? They've got a lot of, catabolic processes where they're breaking down a lot of fat and even protein or muscle as energy. The body will also produce ketones in those states as well. And I think it's mostly adaptive for the brain, because the brain needs glucose normally, right? Like our brains use a lot of sugar to keep our bodies and everything functioning how it needs to go. And our brain uses a lot of that. And so if there isn't that glucose in the system, our brain needs something. And ketones is something that our brains can use. Although there's been some research showing that other tissues can also use ketones as fuel sources. So like cardiac tissue, and theoretically our other working muscles potentially can use it as well. So honestly, that's a red flag for me in and of itself, is that our bodies are only supposed to be using ketones in a starvation state. And it's like, what signals are we telling our body if we're taking those when we're not actually starving? So that worries me a little bit. Now, there hasn't been any direct research showing like long-term negatives from doing that in that sense. But the biggest thing that I've seen with athletes is that it will cause GI issues. So I very rarely had athletes use it before an event or before a training session and not get nauseated. Like, it happens all the time with these athletes. And obviously there's lots of different variables for nausea. We kind of already talked about that. There's a billion different things that could be causing that. But it seems consistent. This is just subjective anecdote, but it seems consistent with that pre-race or pre-event ketone use. I feel like that risk of nausea goes way up. So that's one reason why I never have athletes take it before an event. The other potential benefit that we have seen some research on this is that it can help with EPO production and therefore increase your red blood cell count and your oxygen carrying capacity. And that can certainly benefit endurance athletes, right? There's the whole doping scandals where people are taking EPO and things like that. So if we can naturally increase our EPO, like that could potentially benefit athletes. So the athletes that do insist on using ketone esters, usually we're doing it as part of recovery after their training sessions and not for the actual races. So it's more for the EPO production and less for like the energy of it. So
what about the cognition stuff? Like the during, like you hear, I feel like this is very anecdotal, like, oh, I took it during my race and I suddenly had mental clarity and blah, blah, blah. I don't know. Like you hear that stuff. And I'm curious what your experience has been.
I feel like there may be something there. I haven't seen any convincing research yet. Yeah. And maybe I will. As I see research, I'll change my mind. Like I really try to adhere to what the preponderance of evidence is showing. But
sure.
But yeah, I haven't seen I kind of feel like if your brain's got glucose, like if you're fueling well in the first place, then it's got what it needs. Like you don't have to give it this other source of energy. If you've got enough glucose, you should be fine, right? And there's, caffeine also helps with that alertness and acuity, and that's not glucose. So there could be other things that can help, and ketones may be one of those things. I just haven't seen convincing evidence that's not just anecdotal. Where it can help.
Totally. So. Since we're on the kind of recovery train, we can very briefly mention maybe polyphenols and, things like tart cherry juice. There's all kinds of products, blackcurrant, like all that stuff. Do you ever use that stuff with your athletes? Yeah,
all the time. And if an athlete is having like a balanced diet and they're eating a lot of fruits and veggies anyways, they're probably getting a lot of those polyphenols and things like that, those micronutrients in fruits and veggies and legumes and, nuts and seeds and things like that. And so there's the big ones where we're trying to rehydrate and get our protein and get our carbs in post-exercise. But if an athlete's also willing to throw in greens and berries and use soy milk instead of dairy for those extra polyphenols and things like that, like I'll say go for it. Like I don't see any downsides of doing that.
But you're more of a food, so you're doing that more through food versus like some like Cheribundi and Tubifor and Curans and all that stuff. Like you're going more for food sources rather than the supplement forms.
Usually some of my athletes, if they're making a big smoothie, they'll put in like turmeric, a little sprinkle of turmeric in that smoothie anyway, because it just kind of disappears and it's like, why not? It's not hurting anything and probably protective. So but usually just foods, like they should be eating those foods to get their micronutrient needs met anyways. So why not just have berries in your smoothie or a big handful of berries?
Yeah.
There's also potentially the side effect of having really, really concentrated antioxidants post-exercise where you're kind of blunting. Theoretically, you could be blunting those effects of like making those adaptations from the exercise where it's so anti-inflammatory that you actually need some of that natural inflammation to make those adaptations to your muscular systems. And
that's the same thing with like taking too much omega-3 fatty acids as well, like in supplemental form, right? Same argument.
Exactly. Yeah. So if someone were drinking grape juice or tart cherry juice after every single run, no matter what, I could see that potentially having long-term effects with their training. Now, overall health-wise, that would probably be beneficial and protective, honestly. But if they're trying to get the most out of their training, I'd probably recommend steering clear of like super high-dose vitamin C or something like that directly after every single workout.
Or maybe changing the timing, not of the vitamin C. You should not be taking super high dose vitamin C ever, really, at least to my knowledge. But maybe having some of those, like I love pomegranate juice. I drink it pretty much every day, but
delicious.
Maybe not after workouts. I'm kind of throwing it all over the place. Cool.
Yeah.
Any other kind of little tidbits, anything that you think is really important to add to this discussion? Any supplements that we missed that you want to quickly drop in? Or you think we covered some of the big ones?
Yeah, I think we covered the big ones. Yeah, just re-emphasizing that like there's other things that we should be focusing on first. And that doesn't mean that we can't also experiment with some of these things. But like in the hierarchy of needs, like we need to be eating enough, we need to be hydrating well, we need to be eating a freak ton of carbs, and then we can kind of start looking at some of this stuff. So yeah, and there's certainly benefits, but really out of all of the ones that we talked about, for most endurance athletes, caffeine's probably the only one that we talked about that I would like recommend across the board as long as it's tolerated well to the individual. But the other ones, and there may be more research in the future that shows us like, yeah, okay, this is, and protocols too. That's something that we're kind of lacking in the research space with some of these, like sodium bicarb and ketones. We don't have as much of like the, it's very clear cut with caffeine of like, relatively clear cut with like 3 to 6 milligrams per kilo every few hours. We don't really have that with some of these other supplements. And as more research comes, we'll kind of be able to see what dose and what timing makes the difference, because it's not just whether you're taking it or not. It's oftentimes how you're taking it that really makes the difference. And we as practitioners, we're kind of flying by the seat of our pants right now with some of these supplements because the research just isn't out there. And so it's like, well, let's see what works. It's a lot of trial and error. And sometimes that's risky to do that trial and error with the athletes. So,
yeah. What is on the horizon for you? Are you training for anything yourself? Or I know you're wrapping up your travels, so you're back to Utah.
Yeah, back to Utah in June. We are actually going back to France. We spent a lot of time in Chamonix beginning of our year this year, which was amazing. I loved it there. And I didn't get into CCC last year, but I got in this year. So that's my big race this year is the 100K over in France. And then before that, I'll just probably do a couple of Utah races. There's Twisted Forks, which is, I don't know if you know Finn Melanson on Single Track Podcast.
Oh, yeah.
He's putting on a race in Park City, Utah. So that's like 2 weeks after we get back. It's like middle of June. So that'll be a little rust buster, a 30K. And then I'll probably do Speed Goat 50K. I've done that one once before. And it's great training for CCC. It's basically like half of the course of CCC. So that's kind of what's on the docket for now. Probably a couple of other, fast packing or, bike packing adventures thrown in there this summer. But yeah, that's kind of what's on the docket.
That sounds so fun. And last question, what are some of your favorite sports nutrition products that you use for yourself?
Oh, yeah, great question. My go-to, well, it's been super sporadic right now because I have what's available to me. And, I've been using a lot of like fruit roll-ups and things like that just because, I don't know, we're like kind of isolated on the South Island. We're like super close to Antarctica. Like there's like nothing around us.
So cool.
But so I've been using kind of random stuff, but when I'm home, I use a lot of Never Second products. I really appreciate their gels are my favorite gels by far. They're really liquidy. They go down easy. They have
sodium,
200 milligrams sodium, 30 grams carbs. They've got 75 milligrams caffeine ones, which is like, that's like a sweet spot that I found for myself that I can pound those for many hours in a row, which is awesome. I really like the drink mix too. You can just keep scooping it depending on how much you want in your flasks or your bottles. So they're probably my number one go-to. I also just recently tried Hyperlight.
Oh, I haven't tried that.
Yeah, Hyperlight Fluid Performance, I think is what they're called. That one is really good too. Pretty mild flavor, but it's got 100, well, per 2 scoops, it's got 100 grams of carbs and 1,000 milligrams sodium. Ooh. And I've done a lot of sodium testing. I lose a lot of sodium and I have to drink a lot of fluid. And so having that higher sodium intake is beneficial for me. So, and it's easy to hit those numbers with that. So anyway, yeah, those are a couple of my favorites recently.
Awesome. Well, I hope you enjoy the rest of your adventures in New Zealand with your family. That sounds so cool. It's definitely on my bucket list, and wish you all the luck with your training. Where can everybody find you if they want to reach out, work with you, or just learn more about you?
Yeah, thank you. So I am on Instagram. That's probably like the most accessible place to find me. mountain.sports.dietitian, I think is what I'm on there. I've changed it.
Something like that.
I'm trying to remember. It's something like that. Vic Johnson, look me up. Or you can go to my website, mountainsportsnutrition.com. So those are probably the two best places. And if someone's interested in coaching or something like that, you can fill out. I have a little form thing there you can fill out, and we'll meet and talk it over and see if it's a good fit. So
awesome. Thanks, Vic. This has been such a fun chat. Have a good one.
Thank you.
That's our show for today. Before you go, I have a small favor to ask. If you're enjoying this podcast, would you be willing to share it with a friend or on social media? I would also appreciate it if you're able to leave me a 5-star rating and review. And also be sure to hit follow or subscribe wherever you listen or watch so you don't miss an episode. That really, really helps me and the show. Also, if you would like to support me at no extra cost to you, I do have some affiliate codes that you can use to help support my free content. You can use Eat for Endurance 20 over at Scratch Labs if you're a first-time customer, and I have some other codes on the shop page of my website. Again, that's eatforendurance.com. Lastly, I also have a Patreon page that I have linked to in the show notes, and it's a way for you to give as little or as much as you'd like, and there are some fun perks involved. As always, please get in touch with any feedback, topic requests, or just to say hi. I would love to hear from you. All right, that's it for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you all next time.